Hello everyone, and welcome to the second of our video tutorials on criminal process. In the first video, we looked at the three categories of criminal offence, the criminal court hierarchy, and the criminal appeals process. In this video, we'll be looking at the Crown Prosecution Service, or the CPS. This is revision really, because if you recall, we studied the CPS very early on in the course when we were looking at rules and theory of criminal law. So the CPS can actually come up on two exams. It could come up as a criminal rules and theory question on exam 3, but our focus at the moment is that it could come up as a 10 and or a 15-mark question on section B of exam 1 on the English legal system. So, as we already know, the CPS is the principal public agency for conducting criminal prosecutions in England and Wales, and it was established under the Prosecution of Offences Act 1985. Typically in England, with no police forces and no prosecution service, the only route to prosecution in the past was through private prosecutions that were brought by victims at their own expense or lawyers acting on their behalf. From 1829 onwards, police forces were formed and they began to take on the burden of bringing prosecutions against suspected criminals. But as you can imagine, problems started to develop because the police were not only investigating the crimes, but they were also prosecuting them as well. And there were lots of concerns that police were tampering with evidence. And eventually, this led to the creation of an independent prosecution body, or the CPS. And this body is headed by the DPP, standing for the Director of Public Prosecutions, who answers to the Attorney General. And the CPS has 5 main roles. And you can see here I've bullet pointed these for you. It will advise the police, it will review cases, it will prepare cases for court. We have CPS lawyers who will present cases in court, and they also decide whether to bring a prosecution against a suspect by looking at all the different evidence and deciding whether there's enough to prosecute and also whether it's in the public interest for a prosecution to be brought. So this slide is showing you the structure of the CPS with the Attorney General at the top, DPP underneath. The DPP currently is Max Hill QC, and he's been the DPP since 2018. So you may need to just check that you've got the up-to-date one if you're watching this video in the future, because obviously our DPP's changed. The DPP before Max Hill was a lady called Alison Saunders, and she did come under quite a lot of scrutiny prior to leaving and Max taking over from her. Underneath that, we will have the Chief Crown Prosecutors, the Branch Crown Prosecutors, and beneath that we will have the lawyers and support staff. There was a documentary recently, and it's on BBC iPlayer, about the CPS, and that's really interesting, and it goes into quite a bit of detail. It shows you get to see behind the scenes in the CPS. So that'd be quite an interesting one for you to have a look at. So at the very top of the CPS is the Attorney General, and you just need to be aware of what the role of the Attorney General is. Our present Attorney General is Suella Braverman, QC. Now, she was appointed in February 2020. So again, just be careful that you have got the most current AG in your notes. If you're looking at an older booklet or something, it is possible that you've got the previous one written down. So the Attorney General is the chief legal advisor to the Crown, and one of her jobs is that she oversees the CPS and the Serious Fraud Office, and she's also the principal legal advisor on EU, international law, human rights and devolution. So really, really important role. And you'll notice that a lot of cases that we've actually looked at earlier in the year have been Attorney General reference cases, and there were often unduly lenient sentences are referred to the Court of Appeal in the name of the Attorney General. The Attorney General can bring proceedings for contempt of court, can deal with questions of law on government bills, and looking at all major international and domestic litigation which involves the government. And beneath the Attorney General, the DPP is head of the CPS, and our current DPP, Max Hill, is in charge of instituting and conducting prosecutions, responding to appeals, assisting the coroner in inquests and inquiries, so that will be inquests and inquiries into deaths. So Hillsborough, for instance, there was a big inquiry into the deaths there. They will restrain and confiscate assets used from criminal offences. The DPP will also advise the police, and the DPP will also decide when to end or drop prosecutions. And a bit later on in this tutorial, we'll see that our previous DPP, Alison Saunders, actually came into some flack. She was criticised for perhaps being too willing to drop and to end prosecutions where perhaps she shouldn't have. So you need to have some awareness of how the Crown Prosecution Service decides whether to prosecute an offence or not. And they follow what's called the full code test. And this is a public document that's issued by the DPP, or MAX, as we've just seen, under Section 10 of the Prosecution of Offences Act 1985. And the full code test basically asks prosecutors to consider two things. Firstly, we have an evidential test. So prosecutors have to think about, with the case in front of them, is there a realistic prospect of a conviction? If there's not enough evidence at all, then it's going to fail on this stage. And the prosecutors have to think about, can it be used in court? And potentially, if the police haven't followed their correct procedures, it might be that evidence becomes inadmissible in court. They have to look at whether the evidence is reliable, whether it's credible. So if witnesses have come forward, can they be relied upon, or are they just going to be torn apart by a defence barrister? Obviously, there's no point in bringing cases where there's no prospect of a conviction, because that's a waste of time and money. The other part of the test is the public interest test. So prosecutors not only have to consider the evidence, but they have to consider, is it in the public interest to actually prosecute? And when they're making that decision, they'll be thinking about how serious the offence is, what level of culpability, that means blameworthiness, there is of the suspect. So, high level of culpability, you'd be looking at premeditation, weapons, repeated offences, whereas low level culpability, maybe they were very young, maybe there were mitigating factors involved. They also look at the harm to the victim, the age and maturity of your defendant, the impact on the wider community, whether prosecution is a proportionate response. And this is quite interesting when we think about, there was a recent very tragic case where Caroline Flack committed suicide, and she was being prosecuted by the CPS for allegedly assaulting her boyfriend, and that might have been one factor in why she took her own life. But there was lots of criticism around that case about whether it was actually in the interest of the public to prosecute, because her boyfriend didn't want the prosecution to go ahead. So that's quite an interesting case you might want to have a look at in respect of this. In very limited circumstances, if we don't meet the full code test, we may use the threshold test to charge a subject. And you can see here what the threshold test is, that there's reasonable grounds to suspect the defendant has committed the offence, that there can be further evidence obtained, so maybe we've not got the evidence yet, but we believe we can. The seriousness of it justifies the charging decision. We've got substantial grounds to object to bail, and it is in the public interest. These are going to be very limited cases where we might do this. The CPS will follow casework quality standards, and you've got lots of details on these standards in your booklet. Very important aspect of the CPS topic is looking at the performance of the CPS, or how effective they are, and it could be that you get a 15-mark question asking you to analyse the performance of the CPS. Now on this slide I've got some fairly recent headlines which, well, criticise the CPS. And so I just want to draw your attention to some of these. In 2017 and 18, the CPS came under serious fire, as you can see here in this headline. They were accused of having secret targets, which led to rape cases being dropped. And newspapers reported the fact that the CPS had an unofficial policy for prosecutors to have a, quote, level of ambition of achieving a 60% conviction rate in rape cases, which encouraged them to drop cases that didn't have a really high chance of conviction. The newspaper reported one CPS lawyer to have said, quote, "If we took 350 weak cases out of the system, our conviction rate goes up to 61%. So obviously it's hugely concerning that maybe statistics on success are being manipulated by dropping weaker cases. There was also lots of cases around 2018, early 19, where the CPS were dropping any rape case where there'd been contact between the defendant and the victim by text message or WhatsApp, friendly communications, because again, there was this belief that those cases would not be successful in court. And here another headline saying that Harvey Weinstein rape conviction wouldn't have happened in the UK, and the allegation there was that old-fashioned prejudices about rape have crept into the system. We've got the Lord Janner case here. This was where Lord Janner escaped prosecution for serious sexual abuse of boys. Alison Saunders said it wasn't in the public interest to prosecute him. The CPS twice refused to prosecute Abu Hamza and came under fire over that. And as I said earlier, Alison Saunders was under a lot of pressure just shortly before she quit as head of the CPS, before Max Hill took over her role. Switch screens quickly here just to show you the CPS website, because this is a really useful website to look at, and you might find it really interesting because they publish quarterly data summaries. So if you click onto this, you can have a look at the success for different crimes, for instance. I've just clicked on the CPS outcomes by offence, and this is for the North West, so you might find it quite interesting to see what the conviction rate was for different crimes in the North West. But of course, what you need to remember is perhaps we need to take some of these success stories with a pinch of salt, because as we saw with the newspaper article before, there is a suggestion that weak cases are being dropped so that they're not appearing in these figures, so that we get a higher conviction rate here. Switched back to my previous slide here. So as I say, I think it'd be really useful for you to have a look at the CPS website. And one activity I think could be very useful for you to do is to create a chart like this, where you put performance of the CPS at the top, arguments that the CPS is not effective down here. So you could look at newspaper articles like I've just referred to, so look them up on the BBC News website, and arguments that it is effective, you could actually pull out some of the statistics from the CPS website that you'd be able to use in an evaluation essay on this.